Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. All right, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and welcome back to Comics Explained, a YouTube channel where I will make you a comic book expert in 30 minutes or less. And in this video, I'm going to make you guys an expert on Loki, or at least one part of Loki. More like classic Loki. Okay, so here's the thing. In Marvel Comics, Loki has 3 or 4 different eras, or versions of his character. There is the original Loki as he appeared in Marvel Comics, which we as comic book fans kind of refer to as classic Loki or just Loki. And then you have J. Michael Straczynski's run, which gave us Lady Loki. And then you have the aftermath of Siege on Asgard, which gave us Kid Loki. And then you have Eikol, who's more of an interesting character. I kind of consider him to be a return to form for the character of Loki. So in this video, what we're actually going to find here is we're going to kind of start off in the early days of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's run. We'll go into a little bit of discussion about Walt Simonson, and then we'll actually kind of jump all the way to about the last 2 years of Marvel Comics, and then kind of wrap it up. And the reason for this is because Loki, as we know him in his classic form, originally debuted back in Marvel Comics in Journey into Mystery number 85 in October of 1962. Now, one of the funny things about this is that in these early stories by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, the idea of Loki existing was really more based on the notion that he was an adopted son from the Frost Giants. And that was it, right? We didn't really get a whole lot in terms of how it was that went down. It was just somewhere along the line, Odin came into conflict with the Frost Giants, and that was basically it, and then he adopted Loki. What we ended up getting in J. Michael Straczynski's run on Thor, and we'll talk about that a little bit in this video, and then we'll talk more about it in the next video that we do on Lady Loki. You kind of got this story whereby Loki essentially went back and guaranteed his own adoption. And this kind of played out in the sense that Loki ended up making a deal with Hela and then traveled into the past and encountered the father of Odin, a guy by the name of Bor. And during this time, Loki essentially destroyed Bor's physical form and then kept his kind of spiritual essence locked in ice, or at least it was ultimately trapped in ice. Following that, Loki took on the appearance of Bor as essentially a ghost, with Odin having witnessed his father's death, and then in turn informed Odin that he needed to go adopt a child from, you know, one of his greatest villains, one of his greatest enemies, which ultimately turned out to be Laufey from the Frost Giants, and of course, that's how Loki was adopted. But one of the things that I want to specify here is that in these early stories, Loki was not particularly interesting. And I guess it really kind of depends on what you find to be interesting in comics. For me personally, I never found him to be really enjoyable or fun. It wasn't really until you got into Straczynski's Thor run that he became a really cool character. So basically, Lady Loki going forward. So a lot of the early things were basically Loki being a trickster, right? And not really being exceedingly violent, more just kind of messing with Thor, causing some problems here and there. And the reason for this is because Stan Lee and Jack Kirby didn't really believe in telling exceedingly violent stories for the sake of violence. I mean, they did have stories where characters would die or things along those lines, but there was an interview that Stan Lee had done where he kind of talked about this idea that if a character was going to die, it needed to be something of significance. And so he wanted comics in a lot of ways to be this kind of escape from reality, these sort of flights of fantasy. That's one of the things that differentiated Marvel from DC in the early days, is that in the 70s, DC was dealing with characters like Barry Allen's wife Iris dying and different things like that. And Marvel did that a little bit, right? The death of Gwen Stacy in 1971. But the important thing here is prior to that point, you didn't really see that kind of stuff all that often. It was more or less kind of the struggle of what it meant to be a hero. A lot of this was predicated on the success of the Fantastic Four. And so carrying that into the Thor stories, the notion of Thor kind of being this dual personality, right? Where you had Donald Blake, who was the regular guy, modeled off the Superman Clark Kent persona over at DC Comics, right? The alter ego. And then Thor, who was basically the superhero. And so because of that, when Loki's initially introduced to us, because of the various schemes and the kind of things that he had gotten into over the years, he was basically locked inside of a tree. The stance of Odin here was, you are basically going to stay in this tree until somebody sheds a tear for you. And what ended up happening is Loki used his powers to shake a leaf loose, which fell into the eye of Heimdall, and Heimdall cried. But because Heimdall cried due to the actions of Loki, Loki was basically freed from the tree. And that kind of trickery, that kind of deception and sort of manipulation to a degree, despite it being lighthearted, was essentially a hallmark of Loki's character going forward in Marvel Comics. Now again, for the old Stan Lee and Jack Kirby stories, Loki was okay, and he did some relatively important things. You know, I don't want to kind of skim over it, and I don't want to throw out this idea that Loki had no real significance in Marvel Comics back during the Stan Lee and Jack Kirby era. He did, and in fact, there were 2 major stories that took place during this point in time. The first, as most of you guys know, is Avengers number 1, and the second one came in Journey into Mystery number 100 314 in 1965, right? So looking to Avengers number 1, for those of you guys who are unaware here, what essentially happened is Loki had basically manipulated the Incredible Hulk and set him on a rampage. And the result of this is that the kind of non-mutant landscape of Marvel Comics, and excluding the Fantastic Four, ultimately had to team up. So you got Thor, you got Ant-Man, you got Namor the Submariner, you got these different characters. You got Wasp, who all kind of teamed up and said, okay, like they defeated the Incredible Hulk. And then at the end of the story, that gave birth to the Avengers, right? And so that's kind of where the Avengers came from in Marvel. The Journey into Mystery 114 is more of an unsung story and actually gave birth to a villain that Marvel misused for decades and has only recently turned into somebody interesting. And that's the Absorbing Man, Crusher Creel. So the Absorbing Man, the way this played out is Crusher Creel had been serving a prison sentence, and Loki was looking to create a villain for Thor that could face off against him quite readily and just kind of allow Loki to sit back and wait for Thor to be destroyed, which is kind of a hallmark of his character at this point in time. The result of this is that he concocted a potion that was full of Asgardian herbs and things like that, and then fed it to Crusher Creel secretly. And then when Crusher Creel drank this kind of potion, he was able to essentially turn into any material he touched. Now, as you can probably guess, the potential for that is astounding. It's incredible, but Marvel never really did a whole lot with it. And in fact, I would go as far as to say that it wasn't really until Al Ewing took up the pen in writing Immortal Hulk that Crusher Creel became a far more interesting character that's only really being explored to his fullest potential now, some 40 or 50 years after his creation almost. And so again, these early stories largely dealt with Loki doing things like snatching up Jane Foster and then using her as some kind of pawn or holding her hostage and then facing off against Thor, and then sometimes Thor would lose his hammer temporarily, and then Loki would do something to manipulate Thor would get his hammer back. It was one of these very much kind of cat and mouse situations, and the family dynamic was played up pretty heavily by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, right? In the sense that Loki would engage in some scheme, he'd be defeated by Thor, he'd be handed over to Odin would lock him away inside of like a stone or something like that. Loki would find a way to escape, and he would go right back to it again, just over and over and over and over again. The reality is that the process of Loki becoming really interesting in Marvel Comics didn't really take place until the 1970s, specifically 1973. And the reason why is because Loki in a lot of ways was kind of ahead of his time, right? The potential of a god who was a god of mischief and the kind of chaos he could invoke across the world was something that had great potential, but because of the storytelling nature of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, it was never really seen to its full potential. But all this changed in 1973, and the reason why was because in 1971, Gwen Stacy died. And this is one of the things we've talked about before, and I will say the death of Gwen Stacy didn't have a direct impact on Loki's character in comics, but it had a huge impact on how Marvel wrote comics. Because up to that point, there had never been an instance in comic books where a superhero had failed so disastrously that their love interest died, right? That was just kind of a no-no. That was something that just never happened. And it didn't matter who it was, right? It was a hallmark of comic books ever since the early days of Action Comics, right? Action Comics #1, Lois Lane's in danger, Superman saves her, right? Every single time without fail. But the idea that Gwen Stacy died, and seemingly the way that Jerry Conway did it, was by Spider-Man shooting his web into her foot and her neck snapping, and then you kind of get this other statement by the Green Goblin saying she was already dead. That's still a topic that's debated among fans as to whether or not she was dead before her neck broke. But assuming that you go with the latter and you assume that Spider-Man broke her neck, then ultimately Spider-Man ended up killing his love interest and failing in that way. And so because of that, it totally changed comic books. Now that was kind of a precursor to stories like The Dark Knight Returns over at DC Comics, and even the death of Superman in 1992. It's kind of the story that not a lot of people highlight, but is exceedingly important because it ushered in this age of writing darker stories. And this is one of the things that kind of led into Chris Claremont when he took over the X-Men, being able to write darker, more cerebral, and more gritty stories involving the superhero team that had previously been kind of written as like pretty white kids with problems by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. But nonetheless, kind of back on track here talking about Loki, the reason why this matters is that in 1973, you got a crossover event that was essentially spearheaded by Steve Englehart that was called the Avengers Defenders War. Now, the Defenders were not really an Avengers-esque team, but in my mind, in a lot of ways, they were actually more powerful, right? You had the Silver Surfer, you had the Incredible Hulk, you had Namor the Submariner, Doctor Strange, you had the original Fire Lord, I think. It was a heavy-hitting team, right? It was something comparable to like the Annihilators that you had in Marvel Comics. The whole thing about this is that Loki had essentially teamed up with Dormammu and then tricked the Avengers and the Defenders into going to war over an artifact that was called the Evil Eye. Now, the Evil Eye already did have a bit of history with guys like Prester John and with guys like Dane Whitman, also known as Black Knight, who you guys will be seeing coming up relatively soon in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But in the aftermath of the stories involving Dane Whitman and Prester Johns, ultimately the Evil Eye was gets broken up into 6 pieces and scattered across the globe. The idea of Loki teaming up with Dormammu in order to send the Avengers and the Defenders after the pieces of the evil eye is that when it's assembled, it would allow its wielder to manipulate matter on a atomic level, right? It would just allow them to control essentially everything across the universe. It'd be like having the Reality Stone, assuming you could push it to that point. The result of this is that, or at least the main goal behind this, was for Earth to be pulled into the dark dimension of Dormammu, and basically the entire superhero community to be destroyed. That also works, as far as Loki went, because Loki hated the various superheroes on Earth and wanted to see them destroyed as well. Ultimately, Loki and Dormammu were defeated by the Avengers and the Defenders when they teamed up, but this is one of those moments when the schemes of Loki almost led to the destruction of the world, and it was a pretty cool concept, right? Up to that point in time, Loki's schemes hadn't really gotten to that level. They weren't really on the point where it was like Loki was a credible threat that could lead to the world's destruction. That's one of the reasons why Avengers Defenders is such a significant story among comic book fans. One, because it was a crossover between 2 teams that people wanted to see crossover at the time anyway, and 2, because it elevated Loki beyond being a simple trickster that just kind of caused some havoc for Thor and occasionally did some crazy things, to being a guy who was a legitimate global threat and an actual threat to all of humanity itself. Now, following that, you basically picked up in the mid-1980s and one of the other significant moments of Loki, albeit more comedic. Now, this took place during Walt Simonson's run on Thor, and for those of you guys who are unaware, Walt Simonson's run on Thor is considered to be one of the most significant runs ever written for the character. And a lot of this is because of the fact that, again, Walt Simon was writing a more grounded Thor story, right? Focusing a lot on the Thor mythos. It kind of piggybacked a little bit off the old Tales of Asgard stories that were initially started by Jack Kirby and then later written by Stan Lee, which basically kind of told the whole backstory of Asgard, how it came to be and how we got to the modern era and different things like that. But Walt Simonson's run also introduced the idea of like a true Ragnarok happening in the Thor mythos that was something relatively close to how Ragnarok was supposed to unfold in the real world mythos of Thor and Odin and Asgard and all that kind of stuff. It was not a 1-for-1 ratio. I do want to point that out. It was not an in-comic book adaptation exactly the way that it's supposed to play out in the real world. It wasn't like that, right? It was comic books. There were different liberties that were taken based on the characters as they'd been created and written by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. But one of the more important things that happened here was in issues 364 to 366, which came out in 1986, that basically gave us Throg, where Loki pulled off a scheme where he turned Thor into a frog. Now, it was cool, right? Because you literally had like little frog Thor and like he had a little Mjolnir with him. It was adorable. I'm not even gonna lie. It was like the cutest thing. And the funny thing about this is Throg actually returned as a separate character, right? Because it's one of those concepts where fans don't take it seriously. Fans aren't like, oh man, Throg's here, things are about to pop off, right? Nobody ever really says that, but it's just one of those funny little moments, right? It's one of those little characters that comic book fans are like, oh cool, Throg, that's awesome, right? That's kind of how fans usually respond to his character in Marvel Comics. I know I do, right? But again, it was small little moments like that, right? Just kind of screwing with Thor, messing with Thor. But then you go into another major significant moment for Loki, which was really just kind of Loki being used as a catalyst by Marvel Comics to initiate yet another long-awaited crossover. It was a 2-part story written by Chris Claremont in 1985 going to 1986, which was the X-Men Alpha Flight crossover event. But the way this played out, and this is actually one of the first appearances or the first appearance of the ones who sit above in shadow in Marvel Comics, and we'll talk about them here in a minute, but Loki basically met with this group for the purpose of increasing his own powers in order to make his schemes to destroy Thor and ultimately take over Asgard even easier. And so the way this happened is that the ones who sat above in shadow promised Loki an upgrade to his power, but only if he was able to perform a good deed. And so what he ended up doing was creating something called the Fire Fountain, which would basically either boost the powers of those who already had powers or give powers to those who didn't have them at all. And so the first people to receive abilities here, or boosts to their abilities rather, were Cyclops and Madeline Pryor. And then seemingly everybody on their airliner, on the passenger airliner they were on, received powers as well. Now, the way the airliner went down was reminiscent to Cyclops of a member of Alpha Flight known as the Shaman. And so because of that, it was believed Alpha Flight took down the passenger airliner that Cyclops and Madeline Pryor were on. Nobody really knew why, and initially the X-Men thought it was like an assassination attempt, and so ultimately the X-Men confront Alpha Flight, and then a fight breaks out. They realize something else is going on here, they team up, they discover it's Loki, Loki's defeated. But this was again another instance where it wasn't really Loki himself doing anything major insofar as like facing off against Alpha Flight and the X-Men single-handedly, but it was one of these moments where Loki had instigated a conflict and again kind of brought along a crossover that a lot of fans wanted to see in Marvel at the time. And so following that, you probably go into one of the more significant moments of classic Loki's history, which was in 1989 and 1990. And anybody who's familiar with comic books at this point in time knows exactly what story I'm getting ready to talk talk about, and it's Acts of Vengeance. So for those of you guys who are unfamiliar, Acts of Vengeance was a line-wide crossover event in Marvel Comics. For those of you guys who don't know what that means, whenever you have crossover events in Marvel, usually you'll have like a crossover between a couple of different teams or a couple of different characters, right? You know, the idea of characters teaming up, that was the whole basis behind Marvel 2-in-1 from back in the day. The important thing about this is that this line-wide crossover event was essentially all the titles in Marvel Comics. And that's why Acts of Vengeance is considered one of these seminal stories, right? It's the first time, for example, that Peter Parker got the power of the Enigma Force and became Captain Universe. Different things along those lines, right? A lot of changes were ushered into characters because of the Acts of Vengeance story. But in reality, when you break it down for what it is, it's really just Old Man Logan before Old Man Logan, but on a larger scale. So what ended up happening here is Loki, in an effort to destroy the Avengers, had actually disguised himself as a random stranger and then met with the various villains of Marvel Comics. Now, when I say the various villains, I mean the top tier villains, right? The creme de la creme of the superhero community. So basically, the villains of the most popular heroes, right? The most popular villains of the most popular heroes. And Loki essentially pit them all together, brought them all together, and then had them switch enemies so that heroes, so like Magneto, for example, would not necessarily face off against the X-Men. Different things along those lines. And so the way this played out is that once everybody came to the realization that Loki was the one behind this, well, then all the fighting stopped with the villains, and everybody kind of turned on Loki. But it was stories like that that led to him becoming this character that was really elevated to being hugely popular among fans. And a lot of people really coming to this realization that Loki, if written by the right person, could be a powerhouse in Marvel Comics. Now, the downside to this is you go into the 1990s. And as most of you guys know, the 1990s was a time of chaos for Marvel Comics. So to kind of break away from Loki here for a second, give you guys a little bit of history, which actually kind of goes into the origin of how the MCU came along, if you're interested in that Marvel Comics was basically going broke in the 1990s, right? And we're not going to go into a great big huge discussion as to why. There were a lot of moving parts there, but in essence, Marvel Comics flooded the market with comic books, right? And people were basically buying comics in the hopes they would increase in value over time. When that stopped happening, people stopped buying. And as with any company, when people stop buying that company's product, the company starts going broke. This led to guys like Avi Arad and Ike Perlmutter stepping in and then backing Marvel financially. But one of the things that Marvel also did is they actually outsourced the creation of a lot of their comics to a company called Event Publications. And Event Publications was a company created by two guys named Joe Quesada and Jimmy Palmiotti. But because they were instrumental in keeping Marvel afloat, the reward for Joe Quesada's efforts is that when a new editor-in-chief was selected in 1999 going into 2000, Joe Quesada was given the spot. But when Quesada came into Marvel Comics, his stance was, this place is too chaotic, right? Like, one of the reasons why the comic bust happened is because there's way too many mutants. Peter Parker's being aged by his marriage with Mary Jane Watson, right? Like, just all these different things are going on. We need to basically like thin the herd, right? We need to skim down Marvel Comics. And so he essentially sought to undo all that stuff, right? So one of the first things that happened is the marriage between Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson was nullified in a story called Spider-Man One More Day, which Spider-Man fans still can't get over, and I don't understand why. The next thing that happened is Joe Quesada implemented an event called House of M, where the Scarlet Witch reduced the mutant population down to 2% of what it previously was. Basically 198 mutants. That went into the whole House of M and Decimation era, which was essentially the aftermath of all those mutants losing their powers. One of the other things that happened is you saw the entire removal or disbanding of the Avengers team, right? The Avengers Disassembled. But as a complement to that story, you got Thor Disassembled. And Thor Disassembled is one of the most important stories with classic Loki, and really where we start to end our video here. The events leading up to that, specifically in the 1990s, Dan Jurgens had been writing Thor, and during the end of his run, you had Odin, who died facing off against Surtur. And so as a result of that, Loki basically led a campaign against Asgard with Surtur along with a whole host of Asgardians' enemies, and essentially taking out Asgard itself, right? Now, this story also saw a massive power boost for Thor, but only in a limited capacity. And the way this played out is that once Thor was defeated by the forces of Loki, and Loki essentially took the throne of Asgard and became the new Asgardian king, that you had this event unfold whereby he was greeted with the power of Odin, right? The Odin Force. And it essentially guided him on this kind of quest, the same journey that Odin undertook to gain his wisdom, his power, all that kind of good stuff. And then when Thor did that, he essentially used what were called the Norn Stones, these artifacts that, if they're used correctly, can boost the power of a person to on a massive level. And it actually elevated Thor to a multiversal scale. Thor ended up meeting the ones who sit above in shadow, and then realized the cycle of Ragnarok was perpetual, right? And it had gone on essentially for infinity, right? That Asgard had constantly been destroyed and been reborn, and the ones who sit above in shadow actually feed on that energy. And so in order to stop the cycle of Ragnarok, Thor essentially destroyed all the Asgardians as well as Asgard itself when he destroyed the world emerald tree, Yggdrasil. And so as a result of that, Thor himself perished. And that basically led into the return of Thor during J. Michael Straczynski's run, as well as Loki coming back in the form of a woman. But for this part of the video, we're going to bring this to an end. If you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.